Well, hello, friends. Thank you so much for joining me for season 2 of Reading Michael Jackson. I am your host, Lena, and I'm so happy to be here finally at the start of season 2. I'm saying finally, but really it's been like 6 weeks since season 1 wrapped. I hope you're all having a wonderful holiday season, and I'm so happy to be here with you. This probably came a bit faster than you expected, but this has been the plan all along. I wrapped season 1 and immediately started working on season 2 the same week that I dropped the finale episode of that one. So I am so eager and excited to get back into this show. Before we get there, let me just welcome anyone who is a first-time listener to this podcast. Welcome. It is wonderful to have you here. My name is Lena, and I am the host and creator of Reading Michael Jackson. This podcast is fan-made, is made with love and respect for Michael Jackson and a desire to further understand him as a human being as well as an artist and creative force to be reckoned with. I am what you might consider a newer Michael Jackson fan. I first became a fan in December 2021/early January 2022. And since then, my life has been completely transformed by my obsession with Michael Jackson. No one in my life can escape it, I promise you. And nor would they want to, because wow, what a gift for them to have a big Michael Jackson fan in their lives. But my approach to this podcast comes both from my own personality and my own personal perspectives of the world and life, but also as a former English professor. I say former because I recently had a career change, but I spent many years, almost a decade in academia and teaching English. I have a master's degree in creative writing and a PhD in rhetoric and writing studies. I've done a lot of cultural studies and analysis, and I have published my first book actually this fall of 2025. I've published a lot of my own personal writing and creative writing, as well as some other more cultural analyses and things like that. So I feel in a lot of ways, both as a major fan of Michael Jackson and as a writer and someone who's studied literary writing and language, I feel especially equipped to analyze Michael's writing and talk about Michael's storytelling and worldview as per those publications he put out during his lifetime. So I hope that gives you a bit of an insight into who I am and why I am the person making this podcast. It turns out if you want to do something, you can just do it and no one's going to stop you. And that is pretty much the story of how we got here. So if you don't already know, season 1 was entirely about Michael's book of poems and essays entitled Dancing the Dream. This was a book that Michael published in the early 1990s. So in 2025, from January to November, we spent every single week discussing one piece from Dancing the Dream. I read the piece, I talked about the piece, and then I cried half the time. Needless to say, we're done with Dancing the Dream. So if you are interested in returning to that or learning more about that book and you haven't yet, please feel free to check out season 1. It was a great project, and in a way, that's why we're all here today. But now let's bring us to the present. Let's bring us to season 2. So many times throughout season 1, I mentioned I'm thinking about my options for season 2. Anyone have suggestions? And frankly, no one did. But that's okay, because I had so many ideas and ways I was thinking about approaching this season. But if you already figured it out from the title of this episode to just kind of an obvious next step, this season, we will be focusing on Michael Jackson's autobiography and memoir, which is called Moonwalk. Moonwalk was published in 1988. It was published during the height of the Bad era. He had already started touring, and it was a huge international bestseller. So Moonwalk is far more known to the fandom than Dancing the Dream, which is one of the reasons it was not my immediate first pick for season 2. But then I started thinking, that's the sound of me thinking. I started thinking, well, yes, Dancing the Dream was a perfect season 1. There's so much to analyze. There's so much to interpret. There's all kinds of themes and ideas and things that we can learn about Michael in this very philosophical way so that we have this understanding of who he deeply was. Moonwalk is kind of perfect for season 2, and especially for this exact moment in history. Why? Well, you may have guessed it. In just about 4 short months, the world will be experiencing a resurgence of Michael Jackson mania via the much anticipated biopic being put out by Lionsgate and Universal. This is a film myself and, of course, many, many members of the Michael Jackson fandom, as well as the general public, are bursting at the seams with excitement about. I'm sure if you are here and you are listening to this podcast, you know all about this biopic, so I will not linger there. But here's why that timing is really interesting for us. The Michael Jackson biopic is going to be the first biopic about Michael Jackson alone that is really written from, I believe, more his perspective in an attempt to tell a story of his life on a truly, truly grand scale. By that I mean, major Hollywood motion picture, major worldwide release, and ultimately, from what we understand, it should be fairly revealing. Now, there's been a lot of controversy around that and how revealing it will be, if it will be revealing enough. I think both fans and critics have similar concerns, but for different reasons, of course. But there's a lot of rumors that this biopic will be split into 2 films, with the first film covering based on the teaser trailer alone, which, by the way, I have watched a solid 50 to 60 times by the time I'm recording this. Surely many, many more by the time it is released. But based on the teaser trailer, it looks like the film Michael will be covering Michael's life from his childhood up until most likely the bad era. So in a way, it is covering a very similar time period to Michael Jackson's memoir, Moonwalk, which came out again in 1988 during the bad era. So what's interesting to me is that the narrative time frame of his own autobiography is going to be mimicked in the first truly major Hollywood biopic about Michael. So this immediately struck me as an opportunity. How would deep diving into this book, reading section by section over the course of the next few months and discussing it and analyzing it, give us an opportunity to compare the way Michael himself approved a message being told versus how ultimately the estate in Lionsgate, and even to some respect, members of Michael's family, are approving for it to be told. What will be revealed in Moonwalk that is not revealed in the biopic, and of course, vice versa. So this is where I am centering my interest. How did Michael Jackson tell his own story compared to how others are choosing to tell his story? So this isn't to promote the biopic, but it's also not to criticize it. It is simply giving us a kind of foundation and playing field through which we can view the biopic when it does eventually come out. So what does that mean in terms of our schedule and our efforts? Well, if you listen to the trailer, you already know, but the goal for me is to publish weekly episodes leading up to the week of the release of the biopic. So if you are following along weekly, we will wrap our reading of Moonwalk and any final discussions by the week of the biopic's release. So what does that mean for you? Well, it means you need to keep up with these episodes. It also is important to note that one way this season will be very distinct from season 1 is that in season 1, every episode featured a different piece from the book Dancing the Dream. It was not required as a listener to listen to those episodes in order right? Because each piece did not rely on the previous piece to make sense. They all existed independently, you could say. So if you fell behind a little bit or wanted to skip around a little bit, you totally could. That is not really the case here. Because we are reading a full-length narrative text this season, you will need to show up regularly and pay attention, or else you will get lost, my friends, and I don't want that for you. So that is what you can expect from this season. Each week, I will be reading a section of Moonwalk. I will not say chapter because it is not going to be a perfect chapter breakdown. I will be reading a section of Moonwalk, and then I will be discussing it. So what also does this mean? Well, the episodes will likely be a little bit longer. The time it will take to actually read these sections and then discuss them, who knows? So you not only need to keep up week to week with these episodes, but you also need to carve out potentially a little bit more time for them as well. So this is why I am giving you a pre-episode 1 disclaimer so you can prepare yourself. And on that note, why am I recording an episode titled Season 1, Episode 0? Well, I do have a reason, believe it or not. This episode is obviously not required listening. In this episode, I am introducing the topic and some of the front and back matter of Moonwalk. So there is a foreword and there is an afterword, both of which were added to the original manuscript in 2009 after Michael's death. They're not original parts of the publication itself, but I think they are important and I do not want to miss them. However, there is a lot to cover in these episodes, so I did not want to weight down episode 1 with a ton of front and back matter. So when you listen to episode 1, we will be jumping right into Michael's text of Moonwalk. But today, the focus will be on establishing a groundwork for understanding what exactly is Moonwalk. What should we expect from this, and how should we critically view it when we actually go into reading it and discussing it? There's a lot I can say about that. I have a lot of opinions about it, and that is what today is going to be all about. So sit tight for a moment. Let's get our bearings here, and we will get into some conversation. Okay, so this season we are covering Moonwalk and I am so excited. Now, obviously I started the show reading Michael Jackson in order to discuss Dancing the Dream, but the reason I titled it Reading Michael Jackson instead of something about Dancing the Dream is because I knew I wanted the possibility of continuing this show to talk about other texts, and specifically Moonwalk was on my mind. Because when I first became a fan of Michael, within the first few weeks, I was like, I am in love and I need to know everything about him. So I pretty much immediately ordered both Moonwalk and Dancing the Dream. I read Moonwalk first because I wanted to learn about him, through his own words. And I found that within the first, 3 or 4 weeks of being a fan, reading this book was really interesting because, to be honest, I didn't have a lot of preconceptions about who he was. I just thought, okay, I loved the Jackson 5 when I was a kid. Of course, I love some of Michael Jackson's music, and I'm really, crazy about him right now and watching him on YouTube or whatever, but I didn't know really much more about him. I also thought it was interesting that he published this book when he was so young. I mean, he was only 30 when the book came out. And in the world of literary writing and literary memoir, 30 is considered very young to put out a memoir. I actually think for most people, it would be considered very young. And there's a lot of reasons. I mean, at 30, you have so much life left to live, but also the very nature of memoir as a genre of nonfiction is that there should be some sense or semblance of personal insight and self-reflection and wisdom, where you are able to both embody the experiences of your younger self while speaking with a kind of voice of experience. You can embody that innocence of who you once were through a voice of understanding. That is difficult to do when you're younger than 30. And Michael began working on this early to mid 20s. So that's not really the ideal time frame, for somebody to be writing and publishing a memoir. So I was initially really shocked by that. Of course, reading it, I fell even more in love with Michael. One thing I found as I read was that, every night before I would go to sleep, I would read however much I could before I was too tired to stay awake. And I would find myself loving just like hearing his voice and being with his voice. And I remember when I finished reading it, I remember feeling like, oh, I miss him. I miss his voice in my head, which I recognize sounds unhinged, but that's the reality. I was like, only a month into even really knowing or caring about him. And I already felt this sense of like affection and desire to spend time with him, quote unquote, where I could be in his head. I think part of that, of course, is because he's no longer with us. So with Michael, it's not like with, if you're a fan of other celebrities who are still active. With Michael, it's like every scrap that you get, you're working toward when there's no longer anything new. And even as a 1 month fan, I was concerned about that, which is crazy to look back on now, but it's how I felt at the time. And so I immediately reread it. I've reread this book now several times throughout my fandom. And on first read, I was a bit disappointed in it. I wanted something hyper revealing. I wanted something that spent a lot of time on the bad era. That was the era I was really immersed in at that time. There was just more that I wanted from it. And that wasn't a complaint about the book so much as it's over, really? But that's the nature of it, right? That's the nature of a memoir coming out when you're 30 years old. And it's 30 years later, that's just the nature of things. So needless to say, I do carry a very soft spot in my heart for this book. I absolutely love it. It made me fall in love with Michael. It made me feel connected to him. And, I've read other celebrity memoirs, and there's always a little bit of that feeling of like, oh, I really feel I understand this person differently now. But for me with this, maybe because of when I read it in my fandom, it felt like a step closer to knowing what it was like to know him. And that was really powerful to me. So I'm really excited to reread it. I actually haven't reread this in probably a year or two at this point. So even though I've read it many times, it's been a bit, and I'm so excited. So what we're going to do for the rest of this episode is just talk about some of the front and back matter. I actually am going to start with the afterword. Now, if you don't know, Michael Jackson is technically the author of Moonwalk, but he did not write this alone. Michael had editors he worked with. He had a ghostwriter he worked with. So this wasn't an entirely Michael sat at a little typewriter, pounding away on his keys every night in the hotel after the bad tour. You know what I mean? That's not the way this was. So even though what I'm about to read and share is from the afterword, so it's meant to technically be read when you've finished the book, I think it's actually very relevant to read prior to reading the book. It levels our understanding of what his process was to actually compose this. It gives us some insight into Michael and why there might be certain aspects of this that we question as we read his narrative throughout the next few months. And I just think it's interesting. So with that said, I am going to start this season, I guess, with a reading of the afterword from Moonwalk. Now, this afterword is written by Shay Arhart. I think that's correct. Shay was one of Michael's editors at Doubleday Publishing Company, along with Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. I know, it's so random, right? Why? How did that happen? I don't know. But Shay was one of the editors. So Shay actually wrote this afterword, which was added in the 2009 reissued edition. Michael Jackson had an infectious laugh and a wonderful sense of humor. When Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis and I visited him for the first time at his home in Encino in 1983, he was a gracious and charming host. Waiting with him to say hello were his mother, Catherine, and his sisters, Latoya and Janet, looking as young and fresh as high school students. Michael was dressed in what I would come to regard as his everyday attire: black loafers, white socks, black slacks, a white or sometimes blue Oxford long-sleeved shirt over a white t-shirt. He was sweet and funny and a little shy, but it was obvious that he was honored to have Jackie in his home and pleased that she and I wanted him to write a book. We talked and nibbled on the spread of food Mrs. Jackson had put out for us. And then Michael asked, We talked and nibbled on the spread of food Mrs. Jackson had put out for us. And then Michael asked if we'd like a tour of the house and the grounds. We saw his trophies and plaques, the gold records, and many photographs of Michael with people like Fred Astaire, James Brown, and Elizabeth Taylor, and, well, seemingly anyone who was famous in America in 1983. Michael had impeccable manners, and he wasn't in the least bit boastful about any of this, but you could tell he was proud. A little boy from Gary, Indiana, had managed all of this. The last room we toured had a very large glass terrarium with a lid on it. It was on a low table, and it was hard to see what was inside. Jackie and I were looking around, admiring some very beautiful birds in cages, oblivious to what Michael was up to, when suddenly he turned from the terrarium and said with a sweet smile, "Here, Shay, you want to hold mussels?" Languishing across his outstretched hands was a very pretty boa constrictor. I took it. It felt like damp silk and, much to my surprise, began to move sideways so that I was in danger of dropping it. I exclaimed to that effect, and Michael protectively retrieved his snake with a look of abject disappointment on his face. It was only much later, when he teased me about it, that I realized he was hoping, wildly hoping, for a shriek from me and maybe a hysterical dash out of the room. He was a kid at heart, then and always. Michael was making the music video for his song Thriller while we were in Los Angeles, and he invited us to come see what he was up to. We went out to the studio the next day and met John Landis, who was directing the video, and saw the set, which was riddled with the holes that the ghouls would emerge from. Michael and John began joking about the insurance mess they would be in if we got hurt, and suddenly we were being ushered to Michael's trailer, where we began to talk about what the book could and should be. He was a very visual person, and he thought he might like it to be a coffee table picture book with a lot of text. We weren't set on a particular format, so we were open to discussing anything and everything. It was then that Michael asked Jackie if she would be willing to write a foreword to the book once it was completed, and she agreed. We went back to New York with a book deal in hand, and the adventure began in earnest. Over the 4 years that I intermittently worked and traveled with Michael while he was creating his book, Moonwalk, I saw his delight in the world, his fresh perspective on what most of us would call reality. Michael was an artist, and artists are not like us. They don't want to work in an office, to live conventionally, to never ruffle feathers. Michael lived music. He breathed music. While walking down the stairs or riding in a car, he would open his mouth and a bit of a song he was working on, or a melody that was running through his head, would rise to the listener's ears, and all within hearing range would feel quite amazed to be in the company of someone who was so obviously a musical genius. Michael, we all know, was deprived of a childhood, and it haunted him and kept him in Neverland. He realized how important and special childhood was, even as those of us who were lucky enough to have one did not. He had lived in the land of the grown-ups for too many years, and he saw with wonder and a growing uneasiness that adults frequently live in a treacherous world of brutality, backbiting, and fear. Having been introduced to it too soon, Michael never wanted to live that way. He was deprived of many of the most basic aspects of childhood, And so instead of playing and goofing off, he worked. He traveled from nightclub to nightclub, from venue to venue, from 100 inebriated people in a smoke-filled room to the Ed Sullivan Show. This was no childhood. This was hard work and pressure on the shoulders of a little boy with a gorgeous voice and the electric stage persona of someone 5 times his age. When he was old enough and financially secure enough, Michael created his own world, a place where there was peace and kindness, where every candy imaginable was available in dispensers that don't take money, where a movie theater with popcorn and soda pop sat excitingly empty, the projectionist waiting to hear your wishes, a place where chimps dressed in sailor suits and fun was the only accepted currency. Michael loved being in the company of children because, as he told me many times, children don't lie to you. Children are pure and innocent and good. Being with children is like being blessed, like being with angels. Jackie and I asked Michael to write about his life, because even at the age he was when we initiated the project, he had spent almost 20 years in show business. He was a great performer, a singer, a songwriter, and a dancer whom Fred Astaire admired. What did this amazing young man have to say? What stories did he want to tell? What had he experienced? As it turned out, Michael had been in the public's eye for so long that he had become very protective of those things his fans could not see, did not know. He had been written about at every stage of his life. Facts had been telegraphed, as had falsehoods. He liked the idea that he could set the record straight in his own book, in his own words, but too, there was an overriding desire to leave some things for himself and for those people he loved the most. On our second trip to LA to see Michael, we brought along the designer J.C. Suarez and a hodgepodge of art supplies and big sheets of drawing paper. We stood around Michael's huge dining room table and he talked about what he'd like the book to be. Michael, who loved to draw, and J.C. sketched out pages, and we all talked about the endless possibilities. Eventually, Moonwalk became the book you are holding in your hands, a smaller size but filled with some of Michael's favorite images and a drawing of himself and a signature that he did for us on a blank sheet of paper so we could use it as part of the title page. He loved his fans, and he liked the idea that everyone who owned the book would feel as if they had a signed copy. Michael had an amazing eye. It was he who dreamed up the white glove, the bits of white tape on his fingers, the uniforms. It was he who thought that marching down steps with dozens of blue-suited policemen would look cool, that running through the streets with hundreds of men in uniform would be dramatic and thrilling for the viewer. He sought out the best talent to work with, and he oversaw every aspect of his music videos, which he actually thought of as short films and always referred to as short films. I was with him a few times when people would come to the house to try to get his approval on merchandise they wanted to create. He wanted it to be of the finest quality, to be worth the money people would pay. He wanted it to last. He was a perfectionist. Look again at the music videos. Really look at every detail. Note the care with every shot, every outfit, the lighting. His hand was in everything. His unerring eye was always the final arbiter. I wish I could say he gave the same attention to his book. While he loved books and carried them with him wherever he went, creating one was just not as exciting as finding the right note or step or guitarist, so the writing of this book took a long time. Still, he wanted Moonwalk to happen, or it would not have. He gave me amazing access. After one writer who was helping him was unable to capture what he had wanted, he suggested to Jackie that maybe I could come out to LA and ask him questions, and he would record the answers. The tapes could be transcribed, and he could read them and add material or be inspired by one story to tell another. I had never interviewed anyone. I was clumsy at the task, but he was easy to work with and forgiving. We spent many afternoons talking in his private sitting room and library off of the second floor of the house in Encino with the tape recorder running. It was a pleasant, wood-paneled room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a fireplace. Usually, we'd sit in front of a fire, Michael stretched out on a sofa, me cross-legged on the floor, worrying with the tape recorder. All I had to do was get him started, and he would tell story after story about his family and his childhood, about what it felt like when Motown finally called and Berry Gordy and Diana Ross entered his life. He talked, and then we would get the tapes transcribed. Michael would read the transcriptions and fiddle with them, and so would I. In the evenings, we would sometimes see a movie in the screening room. I remember him taking his friend and advisor, Karen Langford, and me to the LA County Children's Museum, which they kept open for us after hours. We exhausted ourselves, leaping against Velcro walls, standing in front of spinning lights, and throwing ourselves into pools of plastic balls. On the way home, he asked his driver to pull over somewhere near the intersection of Hollywood and Vine, and jumped from the car to dance on his star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, singing some perfect little bit of a song before leaping back in, and off we went into the night. It was exhilarating to be in his presence. He was exciting and funny and brilliant. A few years passed this way. I had a full-time job back in New York at Doubleday Publishing Company, and Michael was busy making videos, writing songs, and recording his next album. Finally, a real writer was given all of the material we had amassed and quickly shaped it into a narrative. When Stephen Davis turned in the final manuscript, Michael had left on the Asia portion of his bad tour. Our CEO, Alberto Vitali, wanted to get the book done as soon as possible. After all, it had been almost 4 years. I explained that Michael was in Japan, and we'd have to wait months for him to return from this portion of the world tour so that he could read and approve everything. "So go," he said to me. "To Japan?" I asked, shocked. "Why not?" he answered with his signature brevity. So I called Michael's people and asked if I could join him on tour to go over the final draft of Moonwalk. Michael said okay, but suggested I meet him in Australia, where his schedule would be slightly less hectic than in Japan. He was going to Melbourne and then to Sydney and Brisbane. I would join him in Melbourne and stay as long as it took to get what I needed. It was in Melbourne that I got to see Michael in concert for the first time. He was an electric performer, and I saw this again and again as we traveled and did show after show. The crowds were huge and mad for him. I wasn't on tour with him anywhere else, but I can promise you that Australians love Michael Jackson. We could work together on the book only on the nights that he didn't have a performance. I had brought 2 copies of the manuscript with me from New York. The first night we got together, I asked Michael how he wanted to work. I suggested that he could read a page while I read the same page, and he could give me any corrections that he might have. He just stared at me with a bemused look on his face. So I said, or I could read it to you, and you could stop me whenever you want to make changes. He grinned and said, "That's a much better idea. Read it to me." So for 2 weeks in early November 1987, in Melbourne and Sydney, when Michael had the time, I sat on one end of his bed in jeans, and he sat at the other in Chinese red silk pajamas, and I read every word of Moonwalk as he patiently corrected mistakes and added material, more near the end. When the last page was turned and we were done, we celebrated, and I took the final manuscript and flew back to America. I saw him in December in LA when he got back from the tour, and we discussed what should be on the cover and how the book should be advertised and promoted. He had made it clear that he wasn't willing to do any appearances, TV or radio, but he did suggest that I could be the one to talk about the making of the book when it came out, and I did, a little. Then, without warning, Michael had a crisis of faith about the book shortly before we were to go to press. His lawyer, close advisor and friend John Branca, who had been involved with the making of the book in so many wonderful ways, called me at Doubleday to break the news. I was stunned. The book was completely done. Introduction, photos, designed cover, everything was set to go to printer. Jackie and I were very pleased with the way it had turned out, but now Michael had changed his mind. For about a week, he and John and Karen and all of us at Doubleday struggled with this dilemma. I think he suddenly felt terribly exposed. He had never said so much about himself and his family and his life. He had never done a book before, and books are powerful. Once the words are printed, they are there forever. Would people like it? Had he revealed too much? Would he feel comfortable having the world know his feelings and his thoughts? Eventually, he calmed down and let go, and we started the presses. Moonwalk instantly became a #1 New York Times bestseller and a bestseller around the world. The year was 1988, and Michael was very happy and proud of the attention the book was receiving, and so, of course, were we. I hope you have enjoyed Moonwalk and that you feel like you know the real Michael Jackson now, because he was an extraordinary man. I have never met anyone like him, and I doubt I ever will. Shay Earhart, New York City, 2009. So that was a lot. That was a lot, right? But I wanted us to start our reading of Moonwalk with this context. Michael wanted to write this book. Michael wanted this book to exist. There was at least a big enough part of him that wanted this kind of exposure and to be understood that made him go through with the process of not only recounting his own life, but putting it out there for the world to read and digest and contend with. There's so much in this afterword that I can touch upon, but in interest of time, I just want to point out a few things. I find it really interesting that Shay says that Michael initially wanted the book to be visual, because while there are photographs in this book, which is very common to celebrity memoirs, it's certainly not a visual book. It is a standard book, standard narrative. What's kind of cute to me is that the book that they basically describe Michael wanting initially is essentially what Dancing the Dream became, right? Like Dancing the Dream became a book that was photographic, and there were drawings and pictures and, all kinds of visuals, and then large blocks of text. And those were poems and essays. And it made me wonder if that was initially his dream, but if there was kind of a push to make it more revealing or more of like a traditional narrative. And I wonder also if that was where perhaps his enthusiasm to work on it waned a bit. And I'm not saying that that is what happened. I'm really, this is just conjecture, If Michael was initially really excited about this idea and then ultimately was kind of like, not working on it and really just wanted to be interviewed and transcribe stuff, like it seems like maybe the original shape he had in mind wasn't fitting with what the publisher wanted. And then it evolved into this. Now that's the way I read it, but it could very easily be that Michael was just not responsive enough at that time. And so they were taking the leads and saying, let's just go with a more straight memoir. Like Shay doesn't really get into how it evolved from that vision to what it became, So I do want to just kind of draw that out as a distinction. But I think it's cool that means that the idea he originally had, he did ultimately achieve. I wish he had done more of it, to be honest, but I'm really happy with what we have. It's cool to hear that was on his mind back in 1983, I just think that's really neat. I also think it's important, although this was referenced in the afterword, that before we start reading, we consider these words. Michael had been in the public's eye for so long that he had become very protective of those things his fans could not see, did not know. He liked the idea that he could set the record straight in his own book, in his own words, but 2, there was an overriding desire to leave some things for himself and for those people he loved most. Now, this is true for anyone writing a memoir. And I say this because the book that I published this fall was part memoir and part research. So I understand very intimately how emotionally taxing and terrifying it is to put out a memoir or a nonfiction book inspired by your own life. I mean, that is an incredibly intimidating thing to do. So I understand Michael's fear. I love knowing that he had certain parameters and a desire to self-protect. I have always felt, and I will say this again and again, I believe Michael was authentic toward his fans. I believe that it was a side of him that he showed us. I also believe there's so much more underneath. There are things he likely did and experienced and felt and wanted that he would never feel he could say to his fan base because it would break their view of him. You know, his fan base was so vast and so diverse that there was simply no way he could keep everyone happy. So the best thing he could do was project that, you know, perfectly sweet, polite, well-mannered, and kind of inoffensive version of himself, but then hold back some other details. And in a way, it's a shame because I do wonder sometimes if Michael felt comfortable being more revealing, would the world understand him better or judge him less in the end? I don't know. But he self-protected. And whether that was the right or wrong choice in the long run is not really for us to say, but it was what he did for himself at the time. And I think we have to respect that. Now, obviously, we know a lot more about his life since he's passed away, and more has come out about him. And, you know, obviously his life progressed in such a way as well. But it's interesting to consider, you know, as much as we're going to read in this book, there's so much left out. And so how did he make those choices, and why is part of what I think we'll be discussing, you know, as we go through this too. I also want to point out how I think it's really cool that it was Michael who wanted to do the signature on the title page of this book to make it feel like for his fans, they all own something with his signature on it. I think that's really neat, and it's really obviously a fan-focused choice, but also just like a really sweet gesture, since most of the world would never be able to attend a Michael concert, let alone get his signature. You know, I think it's just like really sweet. And I did always like that about the book, you know. I also wonder if in part it now serves almost as a reference point for fans who might be looking to buy something with his signature. I know there are a lot of fake products out there that people market as being signed by Michael Jackson, charge a fortune for, and we all kind of have a reference point for what his signature looks like, you know, which is pretty neat. If you own a copy of Moonwalk, you are a little bit more empowered to make good choices when it comes to your Michael purchasing, which, thank you, Michael. That's very forward thinking of you. Just a few other things I want to say about this afterward. There's a part where Shay is talking about how when Michael first started working on this, he had another writer interviewing him and working with him to collect audio and transcripts of interviews they had done. But eventually, he stopped working with that person. Well, if you don't know, there was a period of time in 2023 when a YouTube channel called Celebrity Confidential, I think that's what it's called. I will correct. If I'm wrong, I will make sure I link in the description what it is, but I believe it was called Celebrity Confidential. And every week for a period of time during the spring, they were releasing 5 to 10 minute segments of the audio recordings that Michael conducted with that writer. I do not know where these came from. I don't know who is behind the running of this channel. I don't know where they got the recordings, but they were absolutely incredible. They were usually shared without any context. They were not always shared in order, but they were snippets in which this writer would ask Michael questions and Michael would just speak off the cuff about his feelings about things. And I could tell there were probably times he was revealing things he would not want shared. For example, talking about some of his siblings' careers and their approaches to the work, his unhappiness with the Victory Tour and the way it looked on stage and some of the presentation of it. There is audio that exists of this. However, at some point during this process, after maybe 10 or 11 of these clips had been released, there was a copyright strike against all of them by the estate, and they were all taken down. So they are very difficult to find now. If anyone knows where you can find them, please let me know. But they're difficult to find. But here is a small clip that I did find that I will share just to give you an idea of what it was like.
One thing I don't play at all is I can't stand for a person to be dishonest, number one. Mm-hmm. I can't stand for a person to cheat another person, no matter what. Mm-hmm. And I believe in all fairness because I'm fair. And the people who represent me, as far as lawyers and accountants and things, they have to do the highest form of work. Mm-hmm. I mean, they have to be the best in their field because I'm giving out my best. Mm-hmm. And I'm real hard on them in that way.
But Mike, after that guy told you that you should be doing more of your stuff yourself, who was making decisions for you at that point? Because you're away from Motown. You had managers, or was your dad doing it, or were the man and wives involved by that point, or?
Yeah, they were there. Mm-hmm. They weren't always fair.
So that's amazing, right? I mean, to hear Michael talking, this is probably anywhere between 1983 and 1985 when this was recorded. It is so cool. And when these were being actively released, I was just, oh my God, I was so happy. And you can't imagine the regret I feel for not downloading them when they were available on YouTube. It was something I looked forward to all week when they would drop. It was a really exciting moment in time. Hopefully someday we will be able to hear more. Now, I'm not saying that, it's our right to be able to hear these tapes, but you cannot deny that it was a very cool thing to have access to, right? So needless to say, that exists somewhere. So then he stops working with that person for whatever reason, and then eventually starts working with Shay, and then going on to having Shay come on tour and having, these nightly conversations and reading the book together or being read to, which is very sweet. And so Michael was very involved in the book writing process. I mean, it was all of his ideas. It was all of things he had to say to the world and about his life. But another writer ultimately compiled all of it. So this is something we also need to keep in mind. Some of the language here may not feel like Michael, but Michael did approve it. So we have to keep that in mind when we get critical of it. Michael did approve it, right? So we know that much. Michael would not have put his name on something, especially back in the 80s, that he did not put his full approval on. So let's keep that in mind as we venture into the reading of this book. Now, before I close, I am going to read one final thing to you. And I'm going to read the foreword by Berry Gordy, the founder of Motown. That was written in 2009. I'm going to save everything else for our first episode, but I am going to share that to close. Michael Jackson was not an artist who comes along once in a decade, a generation, or a lifetime. He was an artist who comes along once, period. I had the good fortune of meeting him when he was 9 years old. Even then, there was something so compelling about him that, frankly, I did not know what to make of it. How could this kid have that effect on me? It was an effect so potent that I would immediately discard my misgivings about being in business with kid acts and rush to create an environment for Michael and his brothers that would nurture and expand their talent. Even then, he had a knowingness about him. He knew he was special. He could dance and sing and act like anybody. He just wanted to do it better. He was driven by his hunger to learn, to constantly top himself, to be the best. He was the consummate student. He studied the greats and became greater. He raised the bar and then broke the bar. His talent and creativity thrust him and entertainment into the stratosphere. Moonwalk was the first time he told his story in his own words, reflecting on his life, how he thought, how he felt about things. This book is a unique opportunity to get to know the real genius of Michael and how this young kid from Gary, Indiana, propelled himself to become the biggest star in the world. Moonwalk reveals so much of Michael's true self, but you have to read between the lines to really understand what he was all about. I must say, though, that he did have two personalities. Off stage, he was shy, soft-spoken, and childlike. But when he took that stage in front of his screaming fans, he turned into another personality, a master, a take-no-prisoners showman. For him, it was kill or be killed. Besides being a creative master of writing, singing, producing, acting, and staging, he was also a thinker. And in order to protect himself, sometimes he created mental mechanisms, personalities, on stage, off stage, in boardrooms, in his deal-making, business plans, and self-promotion. Brilliant? Right. Genius? Damn right. He made it all happen. His personality may have been contradictory, but his core was always pure, beautiful, and loving. When Michael and his brothers Jackie, Jermaine, Tito, and Marlon auditioned for me at Motown in Detroit that July day in 1968, they blew us all away with their incredible talent. Little Michael's performance was beyond his years. After singing and dancing like James Brown and Jackie Wilson, he sang a Smokey Robinson song called Who's Loving You, with the sadness and passion of a man who had been living with the blues and heartbreak his whole life. I couldn't believe it. As great as Smokey sang it, Michael was better. I told Smokey, "Hey man, I think he gotcha on that one." Smokey said, "Me too." When Michael and his brothers performed it on the Ed Sullivan Show, there was no doubt that the rest of the world agreed. I moved them out to California, and they became part of the Gordy and Motown families. Those were great times. We swam, we joked, we played games, we rehearsed. I put together a songwriting team, and we came up with 4 hit records for them: I Want You Back, ABC, The Love You Save, and I'll Be There. The Jackson 5 was the only group in history to ever have their first 4 singles go to number 1. We were thrilled, especially Michael. We had broken through a major barrier. For Michael, it was the inspiration to break all the rest. And he did. We cast Michael with Diana Ross in a movie we produced called The Wiz, and there he met legendary producer Quincy Jones. That collaboration yielded the greatest selling album of all time, Thriller, along with Off the Wall and Bad. By 1983, the Jacksons were no longer at Motown. However, the brothers reunited to perform on the television special Motown 25, Yesterday, Today, Forever. After a high-powered, dazzling medley of their songs, Michael took the stage alone and proceeded to make pop history. From the first beat of Billie Jean and the toss of his hat, I was mesmerized. But when he did his iconic moonwalk, I was shocked. It was magic. He soared into orbit and never came down. Though it ended way too soon, Michael's life was beautiful. Sure, there were some sad times and maybe some questionable decisions on his part, but Michael Jackson accomplished everything he dreamed of. Even at 9 years old, his passion was to be the greatest entertainer in the world. He was willing to work hard and do whatever it took to become what he indeed was, the undisputed king of pop the world over. What kid wouldn't give his right arm to fulfill his wildest childhood dreams? Michael loved it all, every moment on stage, every moment in rehearsal. He loved crafting what had never been done before. He loved giving all he had to his music and all he had to his fans. I mean, Michael was awesome, totally in charge. In fact, the more I think and talk about Michael Jackson, the more I feel the king of pop was not big enough for him. I think he was simply the greatest entertainer that ever lived. Berry Gordy, founder of Motown, 2009. So I'm not going to say a ton about this forward, but I will add a couple of things. I had chills while reading almost all of this, and it actually reminded me there is an excellent documentary about Motown. Mostly it is being narrated and led by interviews with Berry Gordy and Smokey Robinson. It is fantastic. There's a great little section on Michael Jackson and the talent he had and how it blew everyone away. It's really cool. But that's what it reminded me of. What I really appreciate is that despite issues with Motown being a little bit exploitative of the Jackson 5, there was obviously this really strong mutual respect between Michael and Berry Gordy. Berry was, a part of his narrative throughout his whole life, and Berry was always supportive of him at so many key moments, and I'm sure we'll address them at different points throughout the reading of this book, but I love that he wrote this forward and ended it with that declaration, the greatest entertainer that ever lived. I think for the most part that is undisputed, although I know there are people who obviously, have opinions about that. I think for the most part, even for the general public, that is undisputed. And in fact, I would say that the response so far we have seen to the biopic teaser, again, at the point that I'm recording this, only the teaser has been released. So if anything happens between this moment when I'm recording and when this is finally released, then what can I say? But the global response has been unbelievable. The teaser has broken records globally in terms of the amount of views of the teaser in a 24-hour period and beyond. I mean, this is a highly anticipated film. People love Michael Jackson. People want to understand Michael Jackson. And so the goal of this season, this podcast, will be to do that. Will be to listen, will be to read, to discuss, to talk about Michael's personal story and go from there. So I want to thank you all so much for joining me for this kind of introduction to Moonwalk. We are going to pick up right away next week. And in fact, keep your eye out because there may be more than one episode coming our first official week of the show. So keep an eye out for that. Be prepared. Stay up to date with this show, my friends, as much as you're able to. We are going to pummel through this book so that we can have it all wrapped up by the time the biopic comes out in April. I'm so excited to go on this journey with you again, to read another one of Michael's books, and to spend a good chunk of 2026 in Michael's head. So thank you so much. And I wish you all a wonderful and happy and safe new year in just a couple of days from now. I will talk to you all next year. Until then, take care.